Hey there, educator. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Lanisha, and I'm all about helping educators make meaningful connections in math instruction. If you've ever attended one of my live professional development sessions, then you know how truly passionate I am about this teacher life. PD for the Soul is my space for providing professional development on the go, where you can take what you need and place the rest on the shelf for another day. New episodes drop every Sunday at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is where we will dive into strategies, routines, and insights to help students build deeper understanding. And here's something new. Our monthly newsletter launches on March 1st. This will be your go-to spot for links to all resources we discuss on the podcast. I want you to have everything in one place. Plus, I'll share the books that will shape upcoming solo episodes in case you want to read along. But that's not all. The newsletter will also explore connections across domains and grade levels, because when we keep those connections at the core of our instruction, we give students the tools to make generalizations that make new concepts more accessible. So, hit subscribe, stay connected, and let's make math happen. See you in the episode. Hey educators, and welcome back to PD for the Soul, the show where we dive deep into the strategies, insights, and best practices that help us make math happen in every classroom. I'm your host, Lanisha, and I'm thrilled about today's conversation. As we head into the final stretch of the school year, teachers are looking at their data and asking the big question, what now? How do we take what we know about our students and use it to drive meaningful growth before the school year ends? That's exactly what we're tackling today with none other than Coach Nakasha Kirkland, a dynamic and results-driven educator who specializes in helping teachers plan with clarity and purpose to maximize student outcomes. We're talking about the moves that truly make an impact. So whether you're driving to work, planning your next lesson, or winding down for the evening, this is an episode you don't want to miss. So let's dive in. Coach Nakasha, please tell the people a little bit about yourself.
I am Coach Kasha. I'm originally from Savannah, Georgia, but I reside now in North Virginia. I just love teaching mathematics. I was not traditionally trained as a teacher. I'm a career switcher. I thought I was going to be on Broadway somewhere, honestly. So I thought about doing all of those wonderful things. I've always had a knack for relating to children and relating to adults. And the idea of teaching math terrified me. I thought I wanted to teach history. Ideally, my dream job at the time would have been an ethnomusicologist. But so something about the history and bringing all that together with the language really excited me. However, you don't really find a lot of jobs doing that. So I became an educator. I thought I could just teach history because, again, I really was electrified by that content. And ended up teaching math. And as a result, I got in tune really quickly with misconceptions because I had so many. There's something around being a teacher that we often forget, that our sole purpose is to transfer knowledge. And if our sole purpose is to transfer knowledge, then we have to be so in tune with, one, what we're transferring, and also the transferee, that it just makes it seamless, right? And so those things really excited me, that brain-based approach. Human growth and development was the class that I took that allowed me to just never look back. And ever since then, I've just been chasing all these brain developments that happen for us. And, as much as we know about the brain, there's still so much we don't know. And that excites me to bring that to the classroom and teach middle school students.
One thing I can say is we connect in that we are kind of the non-traditional educators. We came in from a completely different path.
Right.
We came in, we hit the ground running. Okay. So we didn't come to play games. We are so serious about student outcomes and supporting teachers. Like that's the main thing for us that really helps us and makes us tick. So I did a deep dive into your website. And again, I'm super excited about this conversation today. I really want to get into your approach because it emphasizes repurposing existing lessons to introduce content and clarify misconceptions. So I want you to start off by sharing some specific strategies that teachers can use to efficiently adapt their current materials for better student understanding.
One of the things I always talk to teachers about, and even when I'm talking with administrators, when I'm working with teams, is that there is no shortage of resources. So many states and so many Department of Education have decided that they wanted to put all these resources behind high quality materials. And so when we think about those high quality instructional materials, they think, we can just buy this book, we can buy this resource, we can buy this software, and it's going to help our teachers. And really, That's just not the case. The teachers still have to have the expertise to know how to rightfully yield those materials. And so that's a big chasm that we've missed when we put so much money into resources. But as a result, we have all the resources. So because we have so many resources, one thing that I talk to teachers about is how we could take a simple problem. We could ask students to extend it. We always have these problems like warm-ups where we ask students to simplify a number, but we could also ask students to complicate a number. Like, it's just really repurposing some of the questions that we have. If we know some of our activities ask students to identify certain things, we could give them these same questions, de-emphasize the solution and say, here's the problem, here's the solution, now show me 2 pathways. Those type of activities are ways in which we can repurpose some of the materials that we have. I always say, if you're struggling to get your students to build reason, or you're struggling to find some ways in which your students cannot just answer with the calculator, then you can ask a deeper question. Sometimes so much in mathematics is emphasized around just the right answer. There's so many ways we can get students to delve into the solution path. And how can I see my solution in your solution? And pairing together and really thinking about how we can bring more representation and all of those things into the classroom. And so when I'm talking about repurposing a problem, I'm talking about asking as many questions as you can, taking the time to force yourself to use that same problem, take it through the type of questions you might ask around either Webb's taxonomy or Bloom's taxonomy. And you could even have students make up their own questions. You could give students, here are answer choices for a problem. I need you to help me make up a quiz. Now, the students will come up with the different type of problems that they might ask to another classmate. The class might come together and create a quiz for your next period if you're a middle school or a high school teacher. There's just so many ways to repurpose some of the materials that we already have.
One thing that I'm hearing, something that is resonating with me, is building teacher capacity. So I think as coaches, sometimes it is easy to kind of get caught in that cycle of them relying on us. But really what we're trying to build within them is their ability to take the materials and all these various things that are being thrown at them and them being able to extend it. And so another thing that I wrote down was, instead of us going a mile wide on a lot of these concepts, we're going a mile deep. So I could take a single problem and I can ask all of these various questions, and then having those students to come up with their own questions to share with a peer or partner. We're pushing it a little bit. We're pushing not only ourselves as the educator, but also the students as well. I'm thinking about time management, because we know time is not always something that we feel like we have an excess of, right? So what are some common time wasters? Because some of the reasons why it seems like we don't got no time is because we wasted it. What are some common time wasters that you've identified within lesson planning? And how can teachers really streamline this process so that they can become more efficient?
Let's talk to teachers about how, if you've been teaching for 5 or 6 years or even 20 years, you've only taught a concept 20 times. And that's if you've been in the same grade level. And we know that 20 does not make mastery for you, as in any habit, right? You're not going to develop a habit, a way of thinking, or anything if you only do it 20 times. But what we can do is we can reach for those research books. We could advocate to get ourselves a professional library that is built into our schools. And we could start every unit with some type of pre-assessment. For me, I always encourage teachers to do some type of open-ended task where they are really thinking about, like, how can students show me exactly what they know? And if students don't know anything, how can you ensure that they are going to have some kind of entry point? So what we do is we give them this open-ended task. Students who might have a lot of information to share with us. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm not going to quantify it, but they might have a lot of information to share. They can do so. But those students who might just have questions, sometimes a well-crafted question communicates much more than a statement, right? And so we can have all of our students share that information with us. Another time waster, in my experience, that I see is teachers have their first year 15 times. And what I mean by that is, every single year when teachers are approaching, let's say, proportional reasoning, they start from scratch. they immediately start making new worksheets, or they start making new activities, or they start making new lesson plans. They never take the time to, one, go back and look at their previous state assessment scores. That's going to give them some kind of indication. No, it's not the same kids, but it'll give you some kind of indication of where the strengths lie. You can go back and look at your unit assessments, and some of your unit assessments, those questions, you can look at the misconceptions, specifically around the ones that might have been the most selected, but they were incorrect. You can look at all of that data and decide what your next steps are. Because teachers don't look at data first, or they don't take a moment to reflect on what they did in the past, the biggest time waster I see is they start by unpacking those standards, which is fantastic, but immediately jump to the creation. And in between there needs to be some type of reflection where you're thinking about what has worked in the past and what small shifts could I make. We know in our own practice that we can only shift about 10% of our practice every year. So if you have decided from the very beginning of the school year what your professional goal is, that's another time waster. If you don't have that, you should identify at the beginning of the year, what is your professional goal? And if you know it is ask deeper questions, that gives you a starting point for where you're going to go with your specific activities. But if I had to say just one big time waster, it is starting from scratch every single year. And in that way, teachers, I find, have their first year, like I said, 15 times.
Okay, so you dropped a lot. You dropped some gems just now. Okay, so my question to you was for you to highlight what are some of these time wasters. So one thing is, if we're starting the unit without a plan, we're already wasting time. So we become more focused by facilitating that pre-assessment and then looking at that data that it gives us so that we can start with that plan in mind, start with some focus, some intentionality. Another thing that I heard you say was we got to stop starting each year from scratch. We got to learn from our experiences and then make adjustments based off of that. And I think that is huge because I'm sitting here thinking about just watching my teachers, us coming together for system-wide professional development, us coming together in our professional learning communities. And how often are they thinking about what did I specifically do last year? What do I need to change? And then when we're setting our goals at the beginning of the year, because you mentioned that as well, a lot of times people are setting them just for the sake of that professional development plan that's attached to that administrator and not specifically for their teaching. Like, I'm trying to get better as a teacher, not just for these observations that are happening because they're going to happen regardless. And you just put something really in perspective. You know, we talk about these years of experience, but really when you're talking about 20 years, you really have taught a course from beginning to end 20 times. That's it. That is so interesting. I have not ever thought about it in that way. And I'm just going to have to sit back and let that rest in my spirit because that's doing something to me. Like, I think this is so interesting. Okay. So clarity, we know is key. And I think, you know, starting with that pre-assessment is definitely going to give us clarity for where we're going. Clarity in instruction is just important for student success overall, right? So now, how do you guide teachers in identifying those essential components that they need to replicate student success consistently?
The first, you can't have clarity if you don't know your purpose. And so the first thing I talk to teachers around is when we have unpacked those standards, what is the purpose? We need to pace out what is the purpose for the lessons. And sometimes when we're looking at our state standards, they give us the floor. But we know that there are gaps in sometimes what students need to know in order to perform on grade level. So we need to first dedicate at least 80% of our time to the grade level standards, right? And if we do that, the first thing we need to do is identify what are the student behaviors. So the standard often says students will identify or justify or whatever the language is depending on your state. Well, then we need to take a moment and say, what would I see? What would students be writing? And what would students be doing if that happens? And from there, that's how we set the intention for every single day. Because if my standard says that students will use proportional reasoning, what does that look like? What is the reasoning? If students are using numerical reasoning, what are those things? And from there, 9 times out of 10, if you have 4 or 5 people sitting around a table and they are looking at their standards and unpacking and going into their collaborative learning teams and developing a plan for learning for students, I guarantee you each of them have a different idea around what it looks like when students use numerical sets. So we first got to get on the same page. And once we get on the same page around what that looks like, we can then build activities to elicit that type of behavior. So when we go in, we also do like peer reviews, and we think about like, okay, you said that the intention for learning was that your students would be able to list the characteristics of what it means to be a dog. But what we noticed in your lesson was you did a PowerPoint presentation and you showed them pictures of dogs, and all they had to do was identify which one was the dog. And so in that way, your learning intention is not set. And so your students don't understand. They can't benefit from where you want to take them in that lesson. So when we talk about clarity, the very first thing we have to get on the same page around is what is the intention for this lesson? And what I've noticed in shifting teachers' minds is thinking that we know that sometimes you're teaching a concept for 3-4 days. That's absolutely appropriate. But every day should not have the same intention. Every day should not have the same outcome or expectation for learning. It's having teachers articulate what that looks like. Sometimes it could be skill building, and sometimes it could be an understanding that we need to get them to gain. But oftentimes teachers don't necessarily think about it in that way. I personally was not trained in that way. It took me a lot of work to really think about like, oh God, I got 180 days of teaching. I need 180 intentions. Yes, I need 180 intentions. But once that was clarified for me, the clarification for me brought clarity for my students. Because once I know, if I know this is what I want them to do, I can say, oh, are we finished with the lesson yet? No, Miss Kirkland, we still got to do blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I don't understand why we're off task now, because we still have work to do. And it's just that easy to get my students to go along and help them to stay engaged and to persevere at all those standards that we that we want students to do. But we don't know how, without clarity, we undercut that. If students don't know where it is we want them to go, they're not just going to go along with you blindly, and we shouldn't want them to.
So I have been referencing John Hattie and the effect size a lot on the podcast. And I know that that's your guy too, because learning is your thing. Anytime I have a guest up here and they mention something that I've seen, I got to highlight that effect size. So you talked about teacher clarity, and that effect size is 7,500. Now, the audience knows what our hinge point is. Our hinge point is 4/10, right? So obviously 7,500 is greater than that. So your clarity is going to help you maximize those student outcomes. So I need to say that. I need for that to rest in your spirit, because the people that I'm bringing on the show to talk to you, we're not talking to be talking. We're talking because the things that we have to share are going to change and transform how you're teaching your students. Okay. And I have to highlight this as well. You talked about behaviors. What is it that we want to see? What is it that we want the students to write? What are the students doing? In a recent episode, we talked about those techniques that are mentioned in the formative 5 and how important it is for us to be professional noticers, paying attention to what it is that our students are doing, so that we can ask those questions, right? So that we can prompt them to show us their thinking, so that we can have a better understanding of those things. So we can ask those critical questions throughout that lesson as well, and then craft those optimal exit tasks so that we can really know how students are doing and did they meet that goal. Now, Coach Kasha has talked a lot about students understanding where it is that we're going. This is not just something that the teacher needs to have. The students need to understand where we're going as well, so that they can be checking in on their own learning. Another thing that stood out to me is we got to get on the same page. Now, I'm thinking about from the standpoint of professional learning communities. I'm thinking about team teachers. We got 2 6th grade math teachers or 2 7th grade math teachers. Imagine when we're sitting down and we're looking at those standards, and we now have a purpose. We now have an intention that is aligned. Because I know from my experience, and Coach Kasha, you can weigh in on this, a lot of times people are throwing around terminology and there is not a common understanding of what that terminology means. So until, we address that and we get on the same page, we can't really say that we're on the same page. Just because we're looking at the same page, we can't say that we're on the same page. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Too often we are checking boxes when we do common assessment, but we don't have common strategy. There's absolutely no purpose for us to do a common assessment if we're not going to do common strategy.
I don't even have to say anything after that. Let me just go ahead and get to this next question that I have for you, because misconceptions is something that we already know can hold us back. Okay. And I think even sometimes people have rephrased it to conceptions because students have their level of understanding and they're doing things based off their level of understanding. But what techniques do you recommend for teachers to anticipate and address the misconceptions that could be common for students?
I always talk to teachers around first, we need to come to a common definition of what a misconception is. Because what I find is that often when I'm talking with teachers, they feel like a common error is a misconception. And those are two different things. Students, as they are making sense of the content that we teach, because we are a constructivist discipline by nature, they should be making errors along the way. That makes sense. Students should be making miscalculations, not using the correct notations, all of those things. They should not have formal vocabulary. Those are grade level appropriate mistakes. That does not mean that students have a misconception. When I'm speaking about misconceptions, I'm talking about flaws in the logic that we often see. Students assume that all negative exponents are also less than 0 because negative integers are less than 0. So students are beginning to think that negative exponents makes a value less than 0. They're going to be very confused when they start to explore exponential notation. You might not have taught them that, but that's a long-held belief when they adopted the understanding of working with integers. So they just have misplaced that understanding and overgeneralized or applied it in a place where it doesn't really work. That's also the reason why we need to really take the time to give our students opportunities to build their understanding of divisibility rules. My firm belief is if students don't have an understanding of divisibility rules, they probably will have some misunderstandings around the properties of algebra. If they don't really understand how numbers move on the number line, horizontally or vertically, they can never really understand that bivariate data when we start to say that two things have to hold tight. And a lot of the misconceptions that we find happened in K-5. It's one of the reasons why when you look at most district assessment data, something starts to happen at a decline around 5th grade, then down to about 6th grade. And in 7th grade, typically it doesn't matter, any division, 7th grade usually has the lowest test scores. Well, that makes sense, right? We start to then filter out students. We start to rank them into these programs to decide, who's getting the access, right? And oftentimes our neediest kids gets the most inexperienced teachers. And then something happens on the uptick, right? On the uptick, we now have a group of students who've been persevering through math all this time, who now all of a sudden our high schools have these great scores for Algebra 2 and all these other heavy mathematics disciplines, right? Because we've weeded out all those students who might have, caused those scores to actually look like the population that we have. So those misconceptions we know are things that students hold on to. The other thing about misconceptions, it could be emotional. Misconceptions could be rooted in math anxiety. And if it's rooted in math anxiety, it's going to cause me not to show the behaviors of someone who's competent in mathematics. And if I can't get you to trust yourself enough to take risks, know that making mistakes is a healthy part of building your understanding, I'm never going to elicit you to build any kind of logical reasoning in the classroom through the content in which I teach. Because one, you're not going to believe that mathematics is going to help you in any meaningful way. You just want to get through it because you think of this content as something that happens to you this hour in your schedule on these days, and it's not something that's going to extend into your life beyond that. And so what I do is I talk to teachers around what are the sequences that we need to know in order for students to understand this. And oftentimes in my thinking, it comes back to, what does this mean? Before I can get you to solve 3x equals 9, you need to tell me what it means. And that doesn't mean you're going to just translate it and use this verbal or algebraic language. I want you to tell me that that coefficient is telling you to duplicate that variable 3 times. And when you're done with that, you have a total of 9. I want you to use that language. And so oftentimes it comes down to, can students tell you whatever the concept means in their own words? And if it's not a concept where they have to tell me in their own words, the second thing I want to know is, can you draw a picture of it? And so when we go back to this whole idea of repurposing, You could give students an activity, have them draw images. It's not about the solution at that point. I'm not asking you to solve. I'm just asking you to draw the pictures or the representation associated with that concept. Then once we take that up, now we can go ahead and solve. So in that way, we're repurposing and checking for misconceptions all at the same time, which of course will save us time.
Right back to those time wasters or things that can actually save us time. And I know, and I'm thinking that some of the listeners may be taking in what you're saying in terms of creating the representations, and some of them may be a little scared because they don't feel as comfortable doing those representations, those drawings, or at least that has been my experience with supporting some teachers. Is that piece of it is challenging for them because they're used to the procedure. That procedural skill is something that they connect with a little more easily. So I want us to eventually come back to that. We might not be able to do it in this episode, but figuring out how can we build some of that muscle in teachers so they feel more comfortable going deeper in that way. But you talked about math anxiety, and I want us to also go a little bit deeper in promoting the sense making and reducing the math anxiety. We know that these are key aspects of your philosophy. How can teachers redesign their instruction to foster a more inclusive and growth-oriented classroom environment?
One of the things that I think we have to make sure that we do is that students feel welcome. They need to see us as an ally. They need to understand that you are a monitor in the classroom. They need to know that you're not going to be so fixated helping one student that they're on the sidelines or the fringe being bullied. They need to know that you have a system in place that says that if they are uncomfortable, this is the way in which I can go about my day or go to the next step, whether that be stepping outside for a moment, whether that be asking to go to the nurse and giving a certain look. Whatever it is that we are dealing with humans, we have to have an explicit rule for allowing them to understand how to get to safety. And the other thing I always talk to teachers around is we have all of these ideas around using small groups and math workshop, and all those things are really great. But if you first don't have a way in your classroom that you can say, I need everybody's attention, and the class gets quiet, that is not a safe classroom. You have first got to find a way where your students know that I am in a safe hands when I'm in this classroom. I know for a fact that my teacher got this. She knows exactly what's going on. He knows exactly what's going on in this classroom. And there is very little that can get by this particular individual. And so in that way, we're all going to comport ourselves, and I can then not have to use my cognition to make sure I'm monitoring myself like I'm a squirrel on the playground. I can focus and attend to the mathematics that she is or he is teaching me because I freed up all that cognition. I already know that whoever my bully is, they really can't get to me in this classroom. I also know that if something happens, there's a protocol for me to get safe. We're always, even though we're talking, listening for my teacher's voice so that she can call us back to safety. And I know I can trust her that things are going to happen here. And this is a scholarly environment. And I think without that type of thing, we'll never get to the mathematics. We will continue to teach to the narrow group of students who already got it. There are some students in our classrooms, we cannot do anything all year and they will be fine. But if we want to cast a wide net and open access to all students, there has to be predictability in the classroom. If there's not predictability, then students will always be wondering how can they get safe, and they will never find safety in your content, in your classroom, and definitely not in the individual who is leading them. And so the first thing I do is I talk to teachers around, what is your call to attention? You don't have a call to attention protocol, then we need to stop everything right now and establish one, because there has to be some safety in the classroom first and foremost. And then from there, we can talk a little bit around if students can't answer a question, what do we do? If you're asking students to do an activity and they know that this is something that's beyond their understanding or they are feeling fragile around it, what's the protocol? Again, for me, I always had things in place, and I always encourage teachers to put things in place like ask 3 before you ask me. That's going to foster the independence in the classroom. But also, back to what I said originally, if students cannot give me a solution, they need to give me at least 3 well-crafted questions. They need to go through and annotate their paper. That's what they're working on in literacy. They need to go through and annotate and say, this is the word that's confusing me. this is the definition I wasn't quite understanding. When this number is in this location in this problem, that threw me off. I don't know exactly what this means. And then that way I can it reveals to me where they're getting stuck, but it also reveals to them their next steps. So we go through, we look at their annotations and what questions they have, and we talk about what some next steps might be. And very rarely do I have to talk to students about the same misconception every single time, or the same place where they got stuck every single time. Because now I've given them a tool and I've shown them that getting stuck is a totally appropriate part of the learning process, but it is about what we do next. And I'm here to help you and guide you into that next place.
If you do not have a call to action in your classroom is not safe. Your classroom is not safe. Somebody needed to hear that. And I'm feeling in my spirit that whoever needed to hear it is on the other side of this audio right now. So again, if you don't have something that allows you to get the attention of all of your students, your classroom is not safe. Let that resonate in your spirit. Do with it what you will. One thing that is also resonating with me is if a student has I don't want to even call it a gap. If they're working on something and they do not yet understand how to fully answer the question, they then need to come up with 3 well-crafted questions, and there needs to be some type of annotations on their papers as well. Okay. And so now my next question, this is a sidebar question here. Are these questions, are there stems somewhere in the room so that the kids know how to answer those questions? And then are those annotations related to some type of protocol or routine that you've already introduced them to?
Yes. So I introduced them to this protocol just from the very beginning. It's very, very informal. I always just say, underline where your question, your misconception might be. Where did I lose you is what I often ask. I want you to point on the paper, or I want you to highlight it. I want you to underline or circle what word it was that really confused you. And really, oftentimes, if I'm being for real, it is in the directions that I might have said. On one day, I might have said, a map shows a scale of 3 centimeters equals 2 inches. The next day, I might have said the rate, when I'm using those different vocabulary, I realize that some of my English learners, sometimes they don't get the context or the nuance, or if I'm being just a little too heavy on the everyday vernacular and not the vernacular that they're accustomed to in the classroom, the context can get lost. And that's why it's so important for us to remember that as we're doing things, sometimes the activity hasn't been troubleshooted. It hasn't been tested enough for students to really get what they need from it. And so in that way, they know we're all growing together. So I asked them, if you don't understand what this question is asking you need to highlight exactly what words are tripping you up, what process tripping you up. And if they can't do that, then I say, okay, what did it make you think of? And if we've gotten down to the very last thing where nothing I'm asking them about the specific activity is working, then I go back and I ask them, well, what's the last thing that you really understood today? What's the last thing that we talked about? The last concept that you feel like you really understood when I was teaching, what was that? And tell me what helped you learn. And then I can apply it to this particular concept that I'm trying to teach you now. And I guarantee you every child can answer something around either that specific activity, or if needed, you can widen that activity up and talk to them about what was the very last thing that you felt really good about when you left this class, and what did I do to help you feel that way?
And it really sounds like it boils down to students having some ownership in this whole learning process. So we're teaching them independence. Even if they can't answer a question, they can create one to ask. Even if they can't answer the question yet, they can make some annotations. They can point to what is confusing, the words that they do not understand. So instead of them waiting for things to be given to them every step of the way, we're now building within them this ability to figure out, well, where did I go to the left? Why am I not still on this straight path? Okay, so this makes me think about just making things accessible for all. So now let's get into some equity. When we're talking about equity in the classroom, I know this is a very significant focus for you. So what steps can educators take to ensure all students have equal opportunities to succeed in their classrooms?
When I think about equity, I think about it might not be everything is for everybody, but I want to make space for the way that all students process. So where for me, equity looks like I am consistently tracking what my students are saying and doing. And I'm writing notes to myself to think about like, okay, I gave them this activity. This is their response and their body language. These are the type of questions that they ask. There was this amount of encouragement for them to persevere. Those are the anecdotal notes that I'm taking on my own. But when it comes to the mathematics itself, I'm also thinking like, okay, what are my students saying? What conclusions are they coming to? Is this engaging for them enough to continue to the next problem? And so because of that, I'm always thinking about how can I sequence so that I'm getting all students at the beginning and I'm making sure there's a pathway for every student until we get to the end of that activity. The main thing that I want to know for my students is what are students going to do when they first enter this activity? When they get to this problem, what questions might they have? What do I have that can help them so that I can consistently be the guide on the side and not the sage on the stage? I have dictionaries, I have crayons, I have whiteboards, I have all of these things that students could work on. Okay, I don't want them to come to me and ask me all of these questions around what these terms mean. So I'm going to have a vocabulary sheet ready for them so that they can focus on the mathematics. And in that way, when I go through that process, it starts with me doing the activity first. And when I do the activity first, because that's a critical piece that we're missing, the biggest part of equity is, number one, we have to do the activities that we give students first. And to piggyback off of that, you should have already taken your state assessment for the content you teach. If you haven't taken a moment to take the state assessment, the sample release release questions, release test items, whatever those are, if you haven't taken a moment to solve those problems in multiple ways, then you can't plan for an equitable classroom if you don't know where your students are going to be going. You can't identify strategies and help them scaffold those strategies throughout the year if you don't know where they're going. If you're in a heavy EL population, you should have already taken the WIDA assessment for your grade level. You should have been if your students have to take 4 or 5 different state assessments, then you should have gotten together with your team and each of you taking those 5 assessments. And in that way, a part of being an equitable classroom is that you're making sure that in every class, students are experiencing culture shock every single time they go into a new classroom. And so by developing these systems school-wide, that's going to help you to have a system within your classroom. So if you're developing these systems within your classroom, one, you have to know what the rigor is for your students. And I'm not talking about identifying a verb in a standard. I mean, what is the rigor that you are asking students to reach to? And why is there a difference in your first period's behavior and your after lunch students' behavior? Maybe there needs to be a difference in your approach. We know how the body works. We all passed science. We didn't get voted into these jobs. We have degrees. So you already know the level of cognition that your 8 o'clock class can have can't be the same as your 1 o'clock class. So why are you doing that to yourself and why are you doing that to them? So those are all things about being equitable. You plan for the humans in which we teach instead of saying, by the time I get to my last class, I already got this down packed. So my students know. My students in my first period, they already know I'm going to make mistakes. That's not good. No, that's not okay. That's not equitable. You don't get to have a test run with a whole group of students the whole year. You need to do the activity first, and you need to talk about what you're going to put in place for your first period. What's different for your second period? Oh, your third period is real male heavy. Do something different. Your last period is real female heavy. Do something different. And in that way, we open this idea of inclusion classes. It's not just about the labeling of students. Sometimes it's about the personality of students. And when you get to know your students and first what the intention is for your learning and what it's going to take to get those group of students there, you can't help but have an equitable classroom. That's the whole purpose of equity. The whole purpose of equity is giving everybody what they need so that we all can get there at the same time.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is we got a plan. And I just said in an earlier episode just how important it is to plan and how I had found myself on a side of TikTok at one point where the people didn't want to plan. And I remember one of my most viral TikToks is where people was jumping down my throat because I said we cannot go into a classroom and expect to be successful if we're not planning. And that's the reason why it was viral was because people was tearing me up in them comments. It was tearing me up. They don't want to plan. But in order for me to know and be prepared for how different my students are in the morning versus the afternoon, before lunch versus after, I got to be paying attention and then I got to have a plan. And then I also want to, I don't want to cut you off, but I also want to highlight that you said you're tracking what students are doing. Y'all, I did not pay Coach Kasha to come on here and say that she's tracking what students are doing. I didn't pay her. This is what she came out of her spirit. This is what is on her heart to share with us, that we need to be tracking what students are doing. We need to be professional noticers. We have to pay attention to the kids in our classroom. That is the only way that we're going to move the needle if we're paying attention. We can't go in the classroom and think that we're going to talk at kids and expect something that's just going to stick. We can't do that. And Coach Kasha, I felt like you had something more for us. What else you got?
I was going to say that I feel like it's one of those situations where if you have trauma, it doesn't matter what I'm saying to you. I'm always going to be brushing up against your trauma. And so if you think of lesson plans as this long form that your administrator came in your room and yelled at you because you didn't have 16 pages filled out, or you were supposed to meet with your co-teacher, but they were always pulled to be at an IEP meeting or covering a class, and you never got a chance to meet with them. And at the end, your administrator said, let me get those lesson plans. Oh, you don't have them? Then your evaluation now is going to suffer. That's what I think people hear when we say we need lesson plans, because most of those teachers write all of their little notes on a Post-it note. They have a little spiral notebook that they keep, and they know exactly what they're going to do the next day. And in that way, they don't identify that as lesson planning. And so they're bucking against filling out forms. The most successful teachers who hate to lesson plan have all of these different systems and notes and everything that they've kept. What they're saying is they don't want to fill out a form. And that's fair. But what you can't do is say you've been successful without a plan. And that don't work.
Correct. Okay, so we're going to come off our soapbox real quick, or at least I'm going to come off mine. I wanted to talk about igniting curiosity, because we know that is essential for student engagement. Now, how can teachers develop academic language and the skills necessary to inspire active participation in every lesson? How can we do that?
So let me give the caveat. I'm not an elementary teacher. And so because I'm not an elementary teacher, what I'm going to say, my response is developmentally appropriate. When I'm thinking about middle and high school students, I know one way to foster curiosity into them is to let them play with the mathematics, let them think about the math in a different way, show it in a different context. Also, cross-curricular, problem-based learning, all of those things are really going to capture this. The science is clear on all of that. But I'm not so sure that it has to be in every single lesson. And the reason I say that is because we know that students are going to a much formal understanding or application of mathematics. And you want to also prepare them for that. But what I hope is that in the same way you might have a hard conversation with a friend, you've had so many positive experiences that when it comes to getting to the meat, you don't have to have so much frill and fluff around that because you laid the way for so many positive experiences. And so in that way, if teachers can just balance this idea of really picking out on their pacing guide, what is the most important thing that I need my students to understand? What are the practices that I need for them to rehearse? And what can I plan for when I'm introducing this concept that my students can learn now? And what do I know I need to come back to? Instead of staying stuck in this cycle of proficiency of every standard every single time you introduce it. You might introduce fractions in the beginning of the school year. Some of your students might not get it until April. You can't not teach other ideas until April. So you have to spiral this to keep that investigation and keep that curiosity open so that students begin to see that they are building small leaps every single time. And so my answer to that will really be around your sequencing and thinking about what in my pacing guide can I teach later and what can I teach right now.
Wow, what an incredible conversation with Coach Kasha. If today's episode reminded us of anything, it's that clarity in planning leads to real student growth. Those outcomes that we've been mentioning over and over again. From using data like observations, the things that we're seeing our students doing, their behaviors in the classroom, the things that they're writing intentionally, to designing instruction with purpose. Every move we make as teachers impacts how far our students go. So here's your challenge. I want you to take something that you've heard from today's episode and I want you to implement it this week. Whether it's refining your lesson objectives, using that data from those observations to adjust instruction, or just planning small groups more intentionally. I want you to make an adjustment, decide on something, and let's make this week count. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Plus, our monthly newsletter dropped on March 1st. It was your one-stop shop for links to the resources we discussed today, upcoming book recommendations, and deep dives into making connections across domains and grade levels. If you missed it, be sure to sign up using the link in the show notes so you don't miss the next one. The show notes are also the location for all of Coach Kasha's contact information. You want to connect with her. She has all kinds of workshops that are coming up that you guys can engage in so you can sharpen your skills and maybe you can get with her as your thought partner. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And as always, let's keep making math happen. Until next time.